Hi everyone, Martin Quintana of Quintana Law Group. Today we have a special guest for our audience and we're going to be dealing with family law related issues. So today our special guest is Rafael Vargas of Law Offices of Rafael Vargas. Mr. Vargas, how are you, sir?
I'm good. How are you, Martin?
Everything is well. How's your family?
We're still hanging in here, working from home.
Let's go right into it. There's a couple of questions that people in the audience and others have asked just to get an idea of what's going on out there. So, Rafael, could you tell us at this point, what is the number one most important piece of advice that at this point you'd like to share with our audience during this pandemic and maybe even addressing a couple issues? But what is the number one piece of advice that you would give? Now, mind you, I know you deal with family law cases as well as other areas, but let's talk about family law today. So I want to address maybe three audiences that could potentially be out there. One is people who basically this pandemic has put them to the point where they want to file a divorce. So call it the need to file a divorce versus another audience is already are divorced and they're going through trials and tribulations in dealing with the terms of the divorce that they once agreed to prior to COVID-19. And then the last type of audience would be somebody who's thinking of filing for divorce. So those are the three audiences. Let's talk about the need. What would you say to those people that are in need of a divorce at this point?
First of all, the most important thing for those people to understand is that the courts, although they're physically closed, are virtually open. And that is, the courts are proceeding and you can still file a divorce the same way you would normally. Some of the procedures are slightly different, but there's nothing holding you back from pursuing that divorce if you are in that situation where you need a divorce now. You don't have to feel like you have to wait.
Wouldn't you agree that even though generally people can file a divorce on their own, the reality with COVID-19 as where we're at right now, strongly suggesting to have somebody maneuver the ship, if you will, to make sure that you can actually do that. Because I don't see how somebody right now, if they were a non-lawyer, if they're just going to simply think that they can just get on a computer and start filing motions. So would you agree that it's probably best to have the captain of the ship steer them in the right direction, if you will?
Absolutely. It used to be that you could just walk into the clerk's office at the courthouse and ask them for a packet of papers, fill them out, and hand them over to the clerk there. You can't do that anymore. Anything for a pro se litigant or a layperson, you have to do it by appointment. It's very difficult to get an appointment, to get through to the clerks, and everything has to be filed in a very specific electronic way now because they've gone ahead and changed those procedures. And frankly, if you miss one of those steps, you're going to be going in circles. So you really do need somebody to steer the ship for you.
I would say there's a specific type of individual that I think is always the best client to be served, where both parties agree, right, have an agreement of terms and conditions that, say, for example, an individual like you who could come up with these terms that then that party could potentially speak to the other side and say, listen, rather than drag this thing out, let's just have what would be an agreed divorce so that way things could move quicker and maybe there could be more of a peace within the home or status quo. Is that pretty much how it could work at this point, at least in a perfect world?
In a perfect world, everybody's in agreement, everybody's amicable. What we can do in those instances is draft all of the documents, the agreement, the petition for dissolution, the judgment, get those things revised and signed, and then we can submit them to the court and ask for essentially a Zoom hearing, kind of like this conversation we're having right now, and get them done. And again, going back to your last question, that's something that you're more likely to be able to do with an attorney than by yourself. Because depending on the courthouse, depending on the county, for instance, I'm actually talking directly to the court's clerks and saying, hey, how is this particular judge handling this? So that requires your ability to have that contact information, and then they'll get back to us. What I'm finding is there's not one set process, unfortunately, right now. Each judge is handling it just slightly different. And so that communication and that ability to have that kind of contact is important right now.
And then as far as the audience, if you will, that already has been divorced. They've been divorced for, I don't know, say at least 4 or 5 months. And now they're hitting circumstances where visitation schedule can be an issue, or somebody who's looking to either needs to collect more money or have some type of modification to what they were originally in agreement to receive. Can you talk about that audience? What is the best advice you give to people in those circumstances?
Well, again, everything is operating in terms of your obligations as a former divorce litigant. You still have the same obligations that you had prior to this COVID situation, right? So if you're having a parenting issue that may be related to one parent staying at home versus the other, et cetera, according to the courts, the prior parenting schedules, prior visitation schedules remain in effect. So you may need to file the appropriate things to modify those parenting schedules, because otherwise you're expected to be following your divorce decree and your allocation/custody judgment. Same thing goes with child support and maintenance obligations. If you have a child support or maintenance obligation, maybe someone's laid off, maybe your hours have been reduced, you still have that obligation to meet, and you're going to have to go and let the court know sooner than later that you may not be able to meet that obligation. Otherwise, you're going to be held to that standard. Same thing is if you believe that you're not getting enough support at the moment, and the other party has the ability to provide that support, you need to file those modifications, and you can still do so just as you would have prior to the courts physically suspending.
And the last thing that we were going to talk about, of course, as far as family law issues are concerned is, let's say that we have somebody who might not necessarily think that this is the right time to file for divorce by basically having the party that they're living with served in their home in front of their kids or what have you. That's that person who says, look, or maybe just is having second thoughts about, unfortunately, all the stress that they've gone through at this point and are considering at this point a divorce. Now, that to me is the same individual, somebody who just really needs to get advice. And as far as I'm concerned, I would assume that there's pieces of advice, I would say, that at least if you summed it up in maybe three steps or less is.
Well, first, I'd say don't trap yourself because of this circumstance right now with respect to COVID, right? Don't put things on hold that you wouldn't necessarily have done, because frankly, the way that the courts are working now, there may be a lag, and when they do open back up, you might be stuck in a situation longer than you should have been or could have been. So certainly, as you said, now's the time to get some advice so somebody can walk you through the practicalities of that. Because right. Yes, people are staying at home and they're stuck together in the same confines, and they don't know, well, how do I do this? Am I allowed to leave the house? Do I have to stay? Does he have to stay? Well, those are things that we can walk and talk somebody through, but certainly now's the time to get that advice so you can understand what this process would be like, especially if it was going to be a contested divorce, specifically for things like child support and maintenance. People don't realize that the longer you wait to file that, the longer it's going to take for those things to kick in. And so even if you don't expect to actually be leaving that house for the next couple months, by getting that on file, that maintenance and child support will go, essentially retroactive or backwards, if you will, to when you file, and you're preserving those rights and certainly not prejudicing yourself.
Okay. All right. Well, that sounds good. Thank you for that advice. Lastly, Rafael, I wanted to ask you a question in regards to an order of protection and these domestic battery cases. We've been hearing that there's been a slew of cases that, of course, are related to these issues. So what advice would you say that, giving you a hypothetical, if husband and wife are at home, maybe a couple kids at home as well, and at one point or another in the evening, husband gets accused of battering his wife. Wife calls the police. Police arrive on scene. They speak to both parties, and then it's determined that the husband is going to be arrested. And then at that point, she's going to also possibly be offered the opportunity for an order of protection. What advice do you have there?
Well, the domestic violence courts, by the way, again, are up and running both on the civil side and the criminal side. Again, don't feel restricted in that you can't pursue these things, whether or not at that particular moment you're granted an order of protection. You know, you can go down to 555 West Harrison if you're in Cook County, or to the domestic violence courts and request an order of protection. And then whether or not it's a criminal order of protection, that's the purview of the government or the state. But certainly those things do affect if you are going to have another issue such as a divorce, and they will be things that will come into consideration in that event.
And so you mentioned the word criminal. So when talking about the criminal defense issues, that I guess I could say to the audience is, if you or a loved one are in a situation where unfortunately you are going to have the authorities that are going to be called either to the scene. At that point, there are certain rights that you have. One of the most important ones is the right to remain silent. You do not have to talk to the police and give them your reasoning or your analysis as to what happened. Truthfully, most of the time, if the police are called, generally somebody was going to get arrested, and unfortunately, most of the time it's the person that's claiming that the other party hit them. That's usually the way it works, and then someone's going to jail. But I would say the best advice I would give to anybody is, number one, you have the right to remain silent, so remain silent. Number two, you have a right to an attorney. So if you have an attorney, that's when you get the right to call them. That's when you call them. If you don't get that right at that point, or you don't have one, well, of course, you'll call my firm. And at that point, number three is, as soon as humanly possible, talk to a lawyer, call the lawyer, call me, call whoever, but call somebody to get your case analyzed, because at that point, hopefully you haven't provided a statement to the police that they can use against you in the court of law. And that's typically the way we start off on the wrong side of the case. We want to start off with no statements made and let the facts fall where they fall when we go to litigate the case in court. I would also say, if our audience has any other areas of law, such as wills, trusts, and power of attorneys, that's been a hot topic at this point based on people getting sick, of course, and having to get into hospitals and such. So those are things that if you need assistance with, I have colleagues of mine that work well together and can also connect you as well. Even bankruptcy issues, real estate issues. There's so many issues right now that are affecting everybody as we speak. So I feel that this is an opportunity to continue to provide at least our services and other fellow colleagues' services, so that we could try to maneuver your way through the dark sea of COVID-19. So, okay, well, thank you so much, Rafael. I appreciate it. You've been a gentleman and a scholar as usual. The advice that you've given the audience, I hope, is something that people can really utilize and just understand that. I think the main thing to take away out of this is, if people have questions about what to do in these different areas of law, I think the best is to call an attorney, call someone that you know, or call my firm, and we have people that we trust, and we'll hand over the case to them. But first, I will analyze it with you personally, one-on-one, and then we will go from there. So once again, Martin Quintana of Quintana Law Group. Rafael, thanks again for coming on the show, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you, Martin.